At the end of 2003, a quiet town in Alabama fell into silence when a 15-year-old girl stepped out of her house and never returned. No cries for help, no signs of a struggle, just a cold emptiness left behind in the still tidy bedroom. As night fell, the familiar roads turned strange, and every passing minute weighed like stone in the family's chest. An empty playground, a dense forest, then small items, appearing in places no one expected. Police followed fragile leads, but every clue evaporated like morning mist. There was a traffic stop in the night, blood, a knife, an explanation that sounded reasonable enough to close off suspicion. The case was pushed into the shadows, where time blurred memories and hope. But the truth doesn't disappear. It only sleeps, waiting until science, data, and people are ready to look again. From old social media logs to blood samples once overlooked, the pieces began to shift. And when everything finally lined up, the entire community had to confront the haunting question, what was missed all those years? Before diving deeper into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you love journeys to uncover forgotten justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. At the end of 2003, in a small rural town in Alabama, the afternoon passed in the gentle chill typical of southern winters, as daylight faded over familiar roads, and the surrounding space retained its usual quiet calm. Emma Caldwell, 15 years old, lived with her family in a simple house where daily routines unfolded steadily and rarely strayed from the familiar. Emma grew up under close family attention. She was a gentle, low-trouble girl who always followed schedules and seldom did anything to worry the adult. That afternoon, Emma told her family she would step out to meet a friend for a little while and then come back. A short, familiar announcement without specific details, but enough for everyone to believe it was just another ordinary outing like so many before. There was no argument, no unusual behavior, and the last moment the family saw Emma was when she stepped off the porch, the door closing behind her in complete calm. No one thought it would be the final time they saw her in such a peaceful state. The early hours passed as expected. Household activities continued, dinner was prepared, the wall clock kept its steady rhythm until full darkness arrived, and Emma still hadn't returned. The initial delay was explained by familiar reasons, getting caught up talking or staying longer than planned. However, as the clock hands passed the usual time Emma would be home, the waiting began to shift into clear unease, and the atmosphere in the house grew heavier with each passing minute. The family called Emma. The first call went unanswered. Subsequent calls rang out endlessly, then went silent, leaving an uncomfortable quiet, and the messages sent received no reply. Hope that Emma would answer or suddenly appear gradually gave way to worry, as the silence stretched far longer than ever before. Unable to sit still, family members began splitting up to search the nearby area, walking along roads Emma usually, stopping at familiar places they thought she might be, asking neighbors and acquaintances, but no one had seen Emma that evening, nor did anyone recall seeing her after she left the house. As the night grew late, the air turned colder, the roads emptied of people, and the initial search efforts yielded no sign of where Emma was or when she might return. The family returned home in confusion, trying to make contact once more in the faint hope that her phone would ring or she would call to explain the delay. But all efforts came to nothing, no signal, no message, no new information to dispel the anxiety enveloping the house. Time continued to pass, and the realization that this was no longer a normal late return became clearer than ever, because Emma had never disappeared without warning, never left her family in such hopeless waiting. When the night had deepened and every attempt at self-search and contact had failed, the family was forced to face the reality that they could no longer handle the situation on their own. In their worry and helplessness, the decision to call the police was made, with the hope that outside intervention would either locate Emma or at least provide some answer to the prolonged silence of that evening. The missing person report from Emma Caldwell's family was received and processed according to procedures for minors under 18, immediately elevating the case from initial information to official investigation status. The file was opened with complete basic identifying data, including name, age, residence address, and verified details about the circumstances of her departure. Most notably that the victim had not taken belongings for a long trip and had no history of leaving home without notice. Investigators noted that this disappearance did not match typical behavior for a teenager in the area, especially since the family confirmed Emma always maintained contact and followed schedules. From the initial data, a working timeline was established based on the last time the victim was seen, the expected return time, and the point when the family completely lost contact capability, creating a foundation to determine the range of possible scenarios. The complete lack of response from the victim throughout this period was assessed as an abnormal factor, sufficient to rule out simple delay and require the case to be treated with greater seriousness. Based on the overall assessment, the file was quickly classified as high-risk missing person, meaning no application of the usual waiting period seen in lower-risk cases. This decision allowed authorities to activate early search measures instead of delaying for additional information from family or community. Investigators focused on building a general picture of the victim's daily habits, not for deep psychological analysis, but to identify locations directly related to the disappearance. The initial search radius was narrowed to the area around the family's residence, including frequently used routes, familiar walking paths, and nearby public spots, under the assumption that the victim had not traveled far from home in the early stage. This zoning was not conclusive but considered a necessary starting step to avoid spreading resources thin without specific leads. Simultaneously, patrol units in the area were notified of the victim's description and disappearance circumstances to ensure any observations during duty could be promptly linked to the open file. Information was communicated concisely and accurately, focusing on necessary identifying features rather than speculation, to prevent misdirection from the outset. The investigating agency also prepared plans to coordinate with search support units, ready to expand the scale if the sweep of the near-home area yielded no result. In the case management system, the incident was assigned a tracking number, along with a list of responsible officers and activated processing steps, ensuring all related activities were fully documented and retrievable when needed. Establishing the working timeline served not only to sequence events, but also to identify information gaps to be filled in subsequent steps, thereby prioritizing resources rationally. Investigators conducted a preliminary assessment of the environment around the victim's residence, noting lighting conditions, traffic levels, and factors that could affect potential witnesses' ability to observe, but no assumptions were made about causes or involved parties. All data collected in this phase was treated as background information to guide the investigation rather than confirmed evidence. Force mobilization was deployed at a level appropriate for a high-risk missing person case, ensuring sufficient personnel for initial searches and information handling, while maintaining flexibility to adjust when new leads emerged. When the launch steps were completed, the case was placed in full investigation status, with official responsibility resting with law enforcement, marking the transition from the family's spontaneous search efforts to an organized, systematic and closely monitored process within the legal framework. After Emma Caldwell's missing person file was launched in high-risk status, the investigation focus shifted to determining the last place where the victim was seen or believed to have gone before disappearing, as this was the most critical spatial anchor for narrowing the search area and eliminating unnecessary hypotheses. Investigators began working directly with Emma's close group of friends, concentrating on those who had contact with her in the time immediately before she left home, in order to establish the travel plan she had mentioned or implied in prior conversation. These exchanges were conducted to gather factual information, avoiding emotional speculation, with the goal of clarifying who she planned to meet where and within what time frame, while cross-checking accounts asked individuals to identify consistencies or discrepancies. Through compilation, a specific location gradually emerged as a familiar meeting spot for the local teen group, the playground of a nearby school, commonly regarded as a safe and accessible public space. This information was confirmed from multiple independent sources, showing that Emma had mentioned stopping by this location before heading home, making the playground the last known location in the investigation file. Once the final location was identified, law enforcement conducted a systematic site check, focusing on recording the overall condition of the area rather than immediately searching for specific evidence. The playground was surveyed for layout, entry-exit points, distance to the nearest road, and areas potentially out of sight, to assess the feasibility of an incident occurring without drawing attention. Playground equipment was briefly inspected for signs of damage, disturbance, or any indication of impact or struggle, but no abnormalities were noted. The surrounding ground showed no scratches, drag marks, or signs of resistance, and adjacent areas likewise revealed no clear evidence of violence. The absence of struggle indicators made the hypothesis of a public incident at the site less convincing, while raising the possibility that if something occurred, it happened quickly or left no easily noticeable traces. Alongside the physical inspection, investigators explored the potential for witnesses in the area, including nearby residents, frequent passers-by, and anyone who might have used the playground during the relevant time frame. Inquiries were conducted cautiously, focusing on whether anyone had seen Emma at the playground or noticed her presence with someone else. Collected results showed no direct witnesses confirming Emma's presence at that specific time, nor did anyone recall seeing a teenager matching her description in the zoned area during that period. The lack of witnesses reflected not only the quiet nature of the location but also increased the difficulty of reconstructing events. The absence of surveillance cameras at the playground or nearby areas further limited independent verification, forcing the investigation to rely on statements and contextual inference. From an investigative standpoint, the playground was recorded as the last substantiated point in the victim's movement chain, but the location itself provided no additional direct clues about what happened afterward. This required investigators to accept that the last known location served only as a positioning marker, not as a proven crime scene involving violence. All data related to the playground was documented and stored in the file, including area diagrams, survey results, and summaries of contacts with surrounding residents, ensuring the information could be cross-referenced as needed. Identifying the last location represented a significant advance in the investigation process, as it allowed the elimination of many unrelated possibilities and focused resources on more specific directions, even though the area itself offered no physical evidence or direct witness statement. In the overall picture of the case, the playground was marked as Emma Caldwell's final confirmable stopping point, a clear spatial marker but empty of information, reflecting the elusive nature of the disappearance and laying the foundation for subsequent search steps over a broader scope. When the playground area was determined to be the last location with evidence related to Emma Caldwell, but provided no additional physical clues, the investigation shifted entirely to an expanded ground search focus, based on the assumption that the victim may have left the public area very quickly and entered less trafficked spaces. The initial search radius around the residential area was rapidly expanded to include peripheral zones where the terrain distinctly changed from paved roads to dirt paths, wooded areas, and seldom used trails, as these were locations capable of concealing a person for an extended period without easy detection. Law enforcement coordinated with support units to conduct a large-scale search, dividing the area into small segments to ensure no space within the designated radius was overlooked, while documenting the terrain characteristics of each zone to assess accessibility and mobility for a teenager. Dirt roads and forest trails were thoroughly checked, as they typically have low traffic and could allow someone to enter unnoticed, while densely wooded areas were swept using a linear method to ensure each search team had clear, non-overlapping boundary. Organizing a large-scale search required tight coordination among forces, from personnel assignment and establishing rally points to maintaining communication between teams throughout the sweep, ensuring timely information relay if any discovery was made. Search teams moved through areas with difficult terrain, where visibility was limited by trees and uneven ground, requiring slow and careful inspection to avoid missing even the smallest sign potentially related to the victim's presence. Each searched area was marked as cleared, creating a search progress map that allowed more efficient force coordination and prevented unnecessary repetition. Throughout this process, no direct signs indicated Emma was in the searched areas, no personal items were found, no clear movement traces were detected, and no information from residents suggested they had seen her in these spaces. The failure to locate the victim in high-probability areas forced the assumed range to keep expanding, meaning required resources also increased, creating greater pressure on the participating force. Investigators had to continuously weigh continuing thorough sweeps of designated zones against the possibility of extending the search to more distant spaces, where control and coordination became more complex due to terrain and distance. Time passed without specific results, making every hour of searching more critical as in missing teenager cases, the likelihood of finding the victim safe typically decreases over time, a reality acknowledged in investigative practice though not publicly stated. Time pressure came not only from operational factors, but also from the need to use resources reasonably, since maintaining a large-scale search over a prolonged period requires tight coordination and timely decisions on area prioritization. Deep forest areas and remote dirt paths continued to be checked with extreme caution, but the result remained a complete absence of the victim, with no signs she had stopped, sheltered or passed through during the assumed time frame. Each time an area was confirmed negative, the search map was updated, gradually narrowing remaining possibilities while simultaneously highlighting an ever-growing information gap about where the victim might have gone. The prolonged search without results forced law enforcement to continuously reassess strategy, determining whether the initial assumption about the victim's direction of movement still held, but at this stage, no new data was strong enough to decisively change the approach. Pressure mounted with each unsuccessful search cycle, as every meticulously cleared area without findings reduced remaining options, while underscoring the lack of specific leads to guide the investigation. In that context, physical search operations continued at high intensity, though the results remained a series of negative reports, reflecting the elusive nature of the disappearance, and placing the investigative force under increasing challenges regarding time, resources and decision-making accuracy under limited information. While initial search areas continued to be swept without direct results, a pivotal discovery emerged from the very forest and dirt path zones previously assessed as difficult to access and low in evidence, when a volunteer participating in the search found a small backpack lying off the trail, in a position not easily visible unless moving slowly and paying attention to every terrain detail. The backpack was quickly identified as a monkey backpack, the distinctive child-style backpack shaped like a monkey, which was inconsistent with being randomly abandoned in a dense forest area without a specific reason. Immediately after the discovery, the surrounding area was marked and secured to prevent disturbance, and the information was promptly relayed to the scene investigation team. The discovery of the backpack instantly changed the status of the search operation, as this was the first time since the case began that an item highly likely belonging to the victim was found in the expanded search area. Investigators approached the scene cautiously, recording the precise location of the backpack relative to surrounding terrain landmarks, distance to the nearest dirt path, and degree of tree cover, to assess whether the item had been abandoned on-site or moved there from elsewhere. The backpack underwent preliminary on-site inspection for external condition, showing no signs of damage from wildlife or prolonged natural exposure, a detail that made the hypothesis of long-term abandonment less convincing. During the sweep of the adjacent area in an expanding radius from the discovery point, a second item was found not far from the initial location, a polka dot wallet, positioned lower than the surrounding ground and partially concealed by dry leaves and undergrowth. The discovery of the wallet was immediately considered highly significant, as the simultaneous appearance of two personal items in the same area greatly increased the likelihood that this was not a random coincidence. The wallet discovery area was handled with the same scene protection protocol, minimizing the number of people accessing it and fully documenting details about its position, orientation and spatial relationship to the backpack. When the wallet was opened and its contents examined under controlled conditions, investigators quickly confirmed it contained identification and a medical card, including an ID and medical card bearing the name Emma Caldwell, perfectly matching the information in the missing teenager file. Confirmation of identity from these items marked the first time the case had a direct physical clue, clearly linking the victim to the search area, and ending the phase based solely on spatial assumptions and inference. Investigators noted that the ID and medical card remaining inside the wallet suggested the victim would not voluntarily abandon such important documents without some form of external influence, while also ruling out simple everyday loss. The condition of the wallet and its contents was also evaluated to determine environmental exposure level, providing additional data on how long the items may have lain at the discovered location. With two significant personal items found in the same area, search focus was immediately adjusted, shifting from broad sweeps to prioritizing a new high-priority containment zone. The containment radius was established based on the backpack and wallet locations, combined with surrounding terrain features, including trails, dirt paths, and densely covered wooded areas, to assess the possibility that the victim had moved to, or been brought to this area. The new containment aimed not only to continue searching for the victim, but also to ensure all potential evidence in the zone was detected and protected before being disturbed by human or natural factors. Search units were recoordinated to concentrate on this area, with intensified meter-by-meter inspection within the defined radius, while reducing intensity in previously thoroughly searched areas that yielded no result. The discovery of personal items also raised important questions about how they came to be there, whether abandoned on-site, dropped during movement, or placed after some event. But at this stage, investigators avoided hasty conclusions and focused solely on fully recording objective data. All information related to the backpack and wallet discovery, from timing, discoverer, environmental conditions, to exact positions, was meticulously documented in the case file for later cross-referencing and analysis. Finding the ID and medical card not only confirmed this area's direct connection to Emma Caldwell's disappearance, but also marked a major shift in the case progression, as from this point forward, search operations no longer relied on general assumptions, but had a clear physical anchor, forcing investigative forces to concentrate resources and heightened attention on the newly contained area, the first to yield specific clues about the victim's fate. The containment of the new area following the discovery of the monkey backpack and the polka dot wallet containing Emma Caldwell's identification prompted a reorganization of search operations with a higher degree of focus, as search teams were directed to meticulously inspect every space surrounding the locations where the items were found. During the process of expanding the check and gradually increasing radii, one of the search teams approached a densely wooded area off the main trail, where visibility was severely limited by thick undergrowth and terrain lower than the nearby dirt road. There, an unusual shape was spotted beneath a layer of dry leaves and damp soil, inconsistent with the natural elements of the area, causing the search team to halt and immediately report the find to command. Upon closer approach under controlled conditions, officers confirmed it was the body of a teenager, located not far from where the personal items had previously been discovered, establishing a direct spatial connection between the victim and the case's first physical clues. Immediately after confirming it was a human body, the area was cordoned off according to homicide scene protocol, with clear protective boundaries established to prevent unnecessary entry and ensure no remaining evidence was disturbed. Search teams were withdrawn from the central area, leaving only essential personnel to maintain scene security until specialized units arrived. The scene cordon marked a fundamental change in the nature of the case, as from this point forward, the focus was no longer on searching for a missing person, but on protecting and documenting a scene potentially related to serious criminal activity. Investigators recorded the precise position of the body relative to surrounding terrain landmarks, including its distance from the backpack and wallet discovery sites, tree cover, and accessibility from nearby paths, to establish the overall spatial context without performing any actions that could alter the scene. Weather conditions at the time of discovery were also documented in detail: lower than average temperatures, high humidity, and the presence of thin ice mixed with light residual snow on the ground and leaf cover, reflecting an unusual cold snap for the region. These factors were considered important for assessing the body's condition and evidence preservation potential, while also providing necessary context for understanding natural environmental impacts during the time the body lay at the location. The body was observed in an immobile state, with a posture that did not suggest sleeping or resting, and instead suggested the possibility of a serious event having occurred prior, though at this point investigators still refrained from specific conclusions, pending official forensic evaluation. Identity confirmation was conducted by cross-referencing with the previously discovered personal items, combined with descriptive identifying features from the missing person file, sufficient to establish that the body was Emma Caldwell without needing further on-scene verification steps. This confirmation immediately reclassified the case from a missing person incident to a death requiring investigation of cause, with the initial presumption that the death was not due to natural causes. During scene preservation, investigators conducted a preliminary recording of the area surrounding the body, including ground surface, disturbance of vegetation, and any signs suggesting the presence of others in the area, without yet collecting or analyzing details, to avoid impacting subsequent forensic steps. The discovery of the body near the personal item's location reinforced the hypothesis that this area was directly related to what happened to the victim, while ruling out the possibility that the items had been randomly discarded in an unrelated location. Scene officers also noted that the area was not easily visible from the main road, accessible via multiple small low-traffic paths, a characteristic that made prior detection of the body difficult despite the expanded searches. Once cordon procedures were completed, information about the body discovery was transmitted to relevant units within the investigative system to activate appropriate protocols for a serious case, including preparation for forensic examination and in-depth evidence collection. The determination of foul play was not based on a single detail, but on the combined factors of the scene, body condition, and prior missing person context, sufficient to exclude simple accident or natural cause death. From this point, the case was reclassified in official records, reflecting a fundamental shift in legal nature and priority level, while also requiring assurance that all subsequent steps be performed with the highest possible accuracy. The transition from a missing person case to a homicide investigation did not occur abruptly in procedural terms, but in practical reality it created a clear boundary between the phase of searching with the hope of finding someone alive and the phase of investigating to clarify the cause of death and any related responsibility. The discovery of Emma Caldwell's body near the location of her personal items closed the stage of searching with faint hope and opened a different reality, where all assumptions must be re-examined in the light of a criminal case. Although at this point the questions of how and under what circumstances the victim's death occurred still lacked specific answers. After the crime scene was secured and the case was officially classified as a homicide, the investigation entered its initial peak phase with the sole objective of collecting, preserving, and documenting every piece of evidence that could be exploited within the technical capabilities available. In 2003, Emma Caldwell's body was handed over to the forensic unit for an autopsy, conducted to the extent necessary to determine the cause of death and rule out unrelated possibilities, with the level of description kept strictly within professional limits to avoid speculation beyond what could be proven at that time. The autopsy established that the death was not due to natural causes, not the result of a single accident, and showed signs of external interference, sufficient to confirm this as a homicide, requiring a criminal investigation. Parallel to the autopsy process, biological samples related to the victim were collected and sealed according to procedure, including those needed for potential future comparison, even though investigators were fully aware that the capacity for in-depth analysis was still limited by forensic technology at the time. Sample collection was carried out with the goal of maximizing the future evidentiary value rather than expecting immediate results, since many analytical methods lacked the sensitivity required for definitive conclusion. While the forensic work was underway, another event drew the attention of law enforcement on a remote road not far from where the body was discovered. A pickup truck was stopped during a routine patrol. This stop was not initially linked directly to the case, but it quickly became noteworthy when the officers on duty observed an abnormal condition regarding the driver. During contact, a flashlight beam into the cab clearly revealed a reddish smudge on the driver's chin and shirt collar, with a shape and color that led the officer to suspect it was blood, although there was no basis yet to determine its origin. This blood-like stain was noted carefully, without hasty conclusions, but sufficiently to raise the level of attention toward this individual in the context of an unsolved homicide in the area. Upon conducting an authorized inspection of the vehicle, authorities discovered a knife and a crowbar inside, both showing traces of a dark substance similar to the mark on the driver. These items were seized for investigation purposes, sealed and documented in their condition at the time of seizure to ensure evidentiary integrity for any future comparison. In response to these findings, the driver explained that he had just been engaged in illegal hunting in the area, claiming that the blood on his person and the tools in the vehicle came from processing wild game, a plausible explanation given the local context and the type of activity common in forested and dirt road areas. The officers recorded this explanation without immediately accepting or completely rejecting it, as at that point there was no specific evidence directly linking the bloodstains and seized items to victim Emma Caldwell. A preliminary comparison of the stop location with the body discovery site only showed geographic proximity, but not enough to establish a clear legal connection, especially since elements proving criminal conduct had not yet been identified. During this phase, investigators faced clear limitations of forensic technology. Biological sample analysis could not yet produce highly accurate results in a short time, and many comparison methods, still depended on incomplete databases. Therefore, samples collected from the crime scene and from the stopped vehicle were only documented and preserved, awaiting potential future use rather than serving as the basis for immediate legal action. Initial reports reflected that, despite suspicious elements, the chain of evidence still lacked critical links to irrefutably connect the stopped individual with the victim's death. There were no direct witnesses, no clear traces at the scene indicating the presence of a specific suspect, and the hunting explanation could not be fully disproven with the means available at the time. This placed the investigative team in a difficult position. They had to fully document the unusual details, but could not advance further legally without violating procedure or making unsubstantiated accusations. Investigators continued to build the case file with everything they could gather from autopsy results, biological samples, the traffic stop report, and the list of seized items, all carefully archived with the understanding that their true value might only be realized at a later date. This initial peak investigative phase was thus characterized by both urgency and constraint. Efforts to gather evidence reached the maximum possible within the capabilities of 203, yet still fell short of the threshold of proof required. The inability to establish a direct legal link between the collected evidence and the victim did not render those details worthless. It simply reflected the reality that at that moment, they could not yet be used to support charges or specific prosecutorial action. This phase concluded with a significantly thickened file in terms of documentation but with large gaps remaining in terms of proof, as all the elements needed to identify the perpetrator appeared only in fragmented form, unable to connect into a sufficiently strong logical chain to meet legal standards. This forced investigators to accept that the evidence gathered in 2003 could only remain at the level of documentation and preservation, awaiting more favorable conditions for its use. When the initial peak investigative phase ended without producing a decisive breakthrough, investigators were forced to confront the reality that the elements required for criminal prosecution had not yet converged sufficiently to meet legal standards. Although the file had been augmented with many important documents from autopsy results, collected and preserved biological samples, to the traffic stop report and list of seized items, all remained as disjointed pieces, unable to form a continuous chain of evidence strong enough to prove criminal conduct by any specific individual. The absence of direct witnesses, the lack of clear signs of violence at the last known location where the victim was seen, and the unavailability of immediately usable forensic evidence to link items to the victim left the case file missing the key component necessary for formal charges. The lead once considered most promising, including the remote traffic stop and the items seized from the vehicle, gradually lost legal weight as the hunting explanation could not be disproven by scientific evidence available at the time. Related biological samples could not yet be analyzed to a level allowing certain identification of origin, forcing investigators to acknowledge that internal suspicions could not be transformed into lawful prosecutorial action. In that context, the investigative avenues that had been opened were progressively narrowed and closed, not because they had been proven wrong but because no new data emerged to pursue them effectively. Early hypotheses, built on spatial proximity and unusual details, were gradually set aside as every verification effort led to the same conclusion: no further progress was possible without exceeding legal boundaries. Pressure from time and resources also played a major role, as maintaining a comprehensive, high-intensity investigation could not continue indefinitely without new leads. The case file grew increasingly thick on paper but made no legal progress, creating a state of stagnation that investigators had to acknowledge. The decision to scale back investigative activity was made after command levels conducted a comprehensive review of what had been achieved and what was still missing, concluding that continuing the current approach would not yield different results. The most hoped-for leads were removed from priority status, not because they had been satisfactorily explained, but because they could not withstand the evidentiary requirements of a criminal prosecution process. As the main investigative directions were successively closed, the case file entered a state of no longer being actively pursued, with processing steps suspended and maintained only at the level of storage and monitoring. Within the law enforcement agency's case management system, the case was reclassified and placed in the cold case category, reflecting the reality that Emma Caldwell's death remained unsolved, and no suspect had been charged at that point. Designating the case as a cold case did not mean it was forgotten, but it marked a clear breaking point in the investigative process, where initial efforts had reached the limit of available capabilities and tools. From a procedural standpoint, the file was sealed according to regulations, physical evidence continued to be stored in evidence lockers, and the case shifted to a waiting status, existing as an unanswered question within the legal system. This breaking point was not merely the halt of a specific investigation, it was also an acknowledgement that at that time and with what was available, Emma Caldwell's death could not be fully brought to light, leaving a prolonged gap in the file and transforming the case from an active investigation into an unsolved cold case. After Emma Caldwell's case was classified as a cold case and remained in storage for an extended period, the file was eventually transferred to the specialized unit responsible for handling unsolved cases. There, the first task was not to search for new leads, but to reread everything that had previously been documented. The cold case unit received the complete original file, including crime scene reports, autopsy records, witness statements, evidence lists, and all investigative notes created during the initial peak phase, with the goal of understanding not only what had been done, but also what had never been fully pursued. The review was not conducted to find individual errors, but to reconstruct the original investigative timeline as a continuous sequence, from the moment the victim went missing until the case stalled, in order to identify information existing within the file's very structure. Cold case unit investigators read each report with great care, cross-referencing timelines, locations, and recorded actions, thereby marking areas where information remained only at a general descriptive level, or had not been clarified with objective data. These blind spots were not necessarily mistakes. They often reflected limitations of resources, technology, or investigative priorities at the time the case was still hot, when pressure to act quickly sometimes left certain details unexplored. During the review, investigators clearly identified leads once considered central, but later dropped due to insufficient legal grounds, while also noting why they could not be further exploited in the original context. Marking these blind spots was not intended to immediately revive old investigative directions, but to create a cognitive map of the file, showing which areas had been closed due to lack of tools or data, rather than because they had been proven irrelevant. In parallel with identifying information gaps, the cold case unit focused on inventorying all remaining physical evidence, from the victim's personal items to biological samples, seizure reports, and documents related to events once deemed noteworthy during the initial investigation. Each item was cross-checked against sealed records, storage condition, and chain of custody documentation to determine whether it still existed or had been destroyed per regulations, as well as to assess the integrity of each sample. This process was not aimed at reanalyzing or reinterpreting evidence, but solely at confirming what remained in the agency's possession and what had been permanently lost over time. Identifying preserved evidence played a crucial role in evaluating the feasibility of reopening or continuing the case in the future, as it allowed the cold case unit to understand the file's real-world limitations, rather than building assumptions on non-existent material. During the review, investigators also paid attention to how information had been recorded and archived in the original file, noting that some reports were more descriptive than analytical, a reflection of the working style and procedural requirements of that era. This helped them distinguish between verified details and merely provisional assessments, avoiding the risk of unintentionally treating old assumptions as proven facts. Reading the file in this manner enabled the cold case unit to approach the case with a neutral perspective, unaffected by the emotional pressure or expectations present during the initial investigation, while creating the conditions to recognize points that previous investigators had been forced to overlook. The entire review process was documented in internal notes, not to generate new conclusions, but to establish a shared foundation of understanding for the unit, ensuring every member fully grasped the file's structure, the decisions that had been made, and the limitations that had existed. When the review of the old case file was completed, the cold case unit possessed a clear picture of Emma Caldwell's case as it had been investigated and archived, with blind spots identified, remaining evidence confirmed, and a full understanding of why the case had previously stalled, creating the necessary foundation for any subsequent steps that stayed within the boundaries of what the existing file permitted. With a newly formed foundation of understanding gained from the comprehensive review of the entire old case file, The cold case unit focused its attention on an event that had been recorded in detail, but had never become the central axis of the case. The traffic stop that occurred on a remote road during the initial investigation period. Instead of treating this event as an isolated situation, the investigators approached it by re-establishing the entire timeline context, cross-referencing the time of the stop with the estimated time of death of the victim as recorded in the forensic file. This comparison was not intended to alter the original data, but to examine how these time markers had previously been understood and utilized, because during the initial investigation, these figures existed side by side but were never pieced together into a meaningful connection. When the time markers were placed on the same axis, the cold case unit realized that the traffic stop not only occurred on the same night as Emma Caldwell's death, but also fell within a time window that could potentially match the final period the victim was still alive. A detail that had previously been regarded as mere geographical coincidence and therefore not prioritized for in-depth analysis. This overlap became far more significant when viewed through the lens of case reconstruction, as it showed that the individual subjected to the stop was present in the relevant area at precisely the critical time window, rather than simply appearing randomly within the same broad geographical space. The investigators continued to scrutinize the traffic stop report with special attention to details that had been recorded but never placed within the overall context, such as the exact location of the stop relative to the body discovery site and personal items, as well as the time elapsed between these events. When these data points were placed side by side, a spatial temporal pattern began to emerge, showing proximity not only geographically but also sequentially, a factor that had been obscured in the initial investigation phase due to the absence of comprehensive analytical tools. The cold case unit also re-examined how the traffic stop had been evaluated from an operational standpoint at the time, recognizing that the primary focus had been on the lack of sufficient legal grounds to detain the person and vehicle, rather than assessing the informational value of the event within the overall case. This led to certain key details being treated as ancillary, such as the driver's psychological state, the unusual nature of the recorded bloodstains, and the simultaneous presence of multiple potential injury-inflicting tools inside the vehicle. When re-evaluated with a different objective, these details were no longer viewed as isolated elements, but as a tightly interconnected cluster of information. The identification of this overlooked overlap did not stem from a new discovery, but from a rearrangement of existing data, demonstrating that many elements had existed in the file, but remained unconnected due to the lack of an appropriate analytical framework. The cold case unit paid particular attention to how the hunting explanation had been accepted as a plausible possibility, not because it was absolutely convincing, but because there was no means to definitively verify or refute it. In that context, the traffic stop gradually lost its central role and was relegated to the margins of the file, existing there as a suspicious detail, but lacking sufficient weight to prompt further action. Reassigning value to the traffic stop was not intended to reconclude the event as incriminating or exonerating, but to determine whether it deserved to be brought back to the center of the file, as an intersection point of space, time, and behavior. Through this analysis, the cold case unit recognized that when placed in direct relationship with the time of death and the relevant area, the traffic stop was no longer a random event outside the case's orbit, but a potential critical node capable of connecting many previously disparate pieces. This realization led to the decision to reposition the traffic stop within the file structure, moving it from a reference position to one that required serious consideration in all subsequent evaluation. This did not trigger any immediate prosecutorial action, but it fundamentally changed how the file was read and understood, requiring all data related to the traffic stop to be examined in light of the clarified time-space connection. When the traffic stop was thus returned to the center of the file, it ceased to be a marginal note and became a convergence point of information, where investigators could continue to cross-check and test other assumptions within the limits of the existing file and evidence, marking a significant shift in case approach, while still respecting the boundaries of the data and evidence already collected. Once the traffic stop was repositioned at the center of the file and the old data was reorganized along a new logical axis, the cold case unit moved to an internal but decisive evaluation step, analyzing why the entire 2003 investigation effort had reached a dead end, despite possessing many noteworthy elements. The focus of this analysis was not to assign individual blame, but to identify systemic limitations, beginning with the chain of custody, which plays a pivotal role in maintaining the legal value of all physical evidence. The file shows that many biological samples and items were properly collected initially, but were subsequently transferred through multiple storage phases, with each transfer fully documented but not always accompanied by optimal preservation conditions, according to modern standards. At that time, requirements for temperature, duration, and preservation methods had not yet been standardized at a high level, resulting in some samples remaining in existence, but stored only well enough for archiving rather than for deep exploitation. The chain of custody was therefore not clearly broken, but it became stretched over time and conditions, causing the legal value of the samples to degrade without any specific procedural violation that could be pointed out. Additionally, the dispersal of evidence across different units, according to initial investigative needs, created a complex storage structure where comprehensive synthesis and cross-referencing became difficult, especially without the synchronized digitization system that came later. The cold case unit recognized that this very complexity contributed to slowing the ability to view evidence as a whole, causing each piece to be evaluated in isolation rather than in relation to the others. Parallel to the chain of custody issue were the clear limitations of forensic science in 2003, when many analytical methods were still in early development stages and lacked the sensitivity needed to produce definitive identification conclusions. The file shows that biological samples were collected with the expectation that they might prove useful in the future, but at the time, analytical capabilities only allowed identification of very basic characteristics, not sufficient to link a specific individual to the scene according to courtroom proof standards. The lack of extensive comparison databases and limited sample processing technology meant the results obtained were more referential than evidentiary, forcing investigators to acknowledge that although reasonable suspicion existed, they could not convert that suspicion into a formal charge. These limitations were not operational errors, but objective realities of the time, yet they created a significant gap between what investigators sensed and what they could prove. Deeper analysis revealed that many initial investigative decisions were driven by the need for rapid action, while the case was still hot, leading to prioritization of directions that appeared immediately legally viable. While more difficult to exploit, leads were sidelined because they did not yield instant results. This directly relates to administrative decisions made during the investigation, when leadership had to weigh continuing resource allocation to an insufficiently evidenced direction against shifting to other emerging priorities. The file shows that narrowing the scope of investigation did not stem from a belief that all possibilities had been eliminated, but from an assessment that no further legally viable path existed with the available data. These decisions, while reasonable in the managerial context of the time, inadvertently closed off certain investigative avenues before they could be reconsidered with more appropriate tools and methods. The cold case unit also identified that the separation between units from scene investigation forensics to prosecution created communication gaps where information was transmitted fully but not always integrated into a complete picture. This caused some critical details to be misplaced within the file structure, diminishing their weight when viewed in isolation. The process error analysis shows that the 2003 failure was not the result of a single mistake, but the resonance of multiple factors, technological limitations, evidence management structure, and strategic administrative decisions made under high pressure. This failure was systemic rather than personal, reflecting how a complex case can exceed the resolving capacity of the investigative apparatus at a specific moment. Understanding these factors is not about rewriting the past or assigning blame, but about precisely identifying the existing barriers, thereby avoiding repetition of the same approach pattern, should the case be re-examined in a different context. This analysis concludes with the realization that in 2003, despite considerable effort and the collection of much important data, the investigative system had reached its natural limit, where continuation was no longer a matter of will or determination, but of the practical capability of the procedures, tools and legal framework then available, forming the core reason why Emma Caldwell's case could not be solved at that time. After clarifying the systemic limitations of the 2003 investigation, the cold case unit shifted to a different approach. Not by introducing new hypotheses, but by returning to the evidence items that had been collected and preserved over many years, with the goal of reassessing their scientific value in light of significantly advanced forensic capabilities. The evidence unsealing process was conducted strictly according to procedure, with the participation of authorized personnel to ensure legality and the integrity of the chain of custody, as any error at this stage could render the analysis results unusable. Evidence items related to biological samples, particularly the blood samples collected during the initial investigation, were retrieved from storage and inspected for preservation condition, with detailed records made of storage conditions, sealing periods, and previous transfer. This evaluation showed that although some samples had been affected by time, they remained suitable for more modern analytical methods than those available in. The blood sample reanalysis was performed in a strictly controlled environment, with standardized extraction and processing steps designed to maximize the recovery of valuable genetic information. Rather than merely identifying blood type or basic biological characteristics, as before, the new techniques allowed extraction of much more detailed DNA profiles, sufficient for individual-level comparison and match. The cold case unit closely monitored each step of this process, not to interfere but to ensure that all results could be fully traced and clearly explained within the legal framework. As the analysis results began to take shape, what mattered most was not the quantity of data obtained, but the ability to directly link them to elements already recorded in the old file. The retested blood samples revealed genetic characteristics clear enough to enable comparison with other previously collected sources that could not be utilized before, creating an intersection point that 2003 forensic technology could not reach. Establishing a direct forensic link did not occur as an instant discovery, but as the result of careful cross-referencing, where each parameter was checked against others to rule out cross-contamination or degradation-related error. Forensic experts confirmed that the DNA profiles obtained met the necessary standards for use in criminal investigation, a foundational advance because it transformed the biological samples from potential to probative value. For the cold case unit, this marked the first time since the case stalled that a clear scientific connection could be established between physical evidence and a specific individual, rather than existing merely as unprovable suspicion. This did not mean every question had been answered, but it broke the long-standing deadlock by providing a new axis of analysis based on objective data rather than indirect information. The results were documented and stored along with the entire analysis process, forming a scientific documentation chain that could be independently reviewed and re-verified if necessary. High caution was maintained, as the cold case unit clearly understood that the value of this scientific breakthrough lay not only in the result itself, but also in its ability to withstand future legal challenges. The unsealing and retesting of blood samples was not intended to prove a pre-existing specific hypothesis, but to answer whether current science could accomplish what the answer manifested through the ability to establish a direct forensic link, showed that time does not only fade memories and leads. In some cases, it also creates the conditions for forgotten evidence to find its voice. In that context, the DNA retesting was not merely a technical step, but a qualitative transformation in case approach, where biological data was moved from the file's periphery to the center of analysis, opening the possibility of connecting previously scattered pieces. The cold case unit concluded this phase with a set of probative forensic results, built on a solid scientific foundation and fully compliant with procedure, sufficient to change the perspective on the Emma Caldwell without needing any new assumptions beyond what the evidence itself revealed. Parallel with the scientific breakthrough achieved through retesting DNA, the cold case unit shifted its focus to another avenue of inquiry that had existed in the case file but had never been fully developed: the online communication data related to Emma Caldwell in the period leading up to her disappearance. The focus of this step was not to seek newly emerging information, but to retrieve old logs from the Nexopia platform, the social network that was once popular among teenagers in the early 2000s, where Emma was confirmed to have had an active account. Retrieving this data presented significant challenges due to the storage characteristics of that era, when platforms had neither the obligation nor the capacity to retain data long-term as they do today, forcing the cold case unit to work with multiple disparate sources to recover surviving information. The old logs were collected from fragmented backups, internal archive documents, and extracts that had been created during the initial investigation but never deeply exploited, as at that time the legal value and analytical potential of online data were still very limited. Once these fragments were assembled, the cold case unit proceeded to verify their integrity, cross-referencing system timestamps, formats, and content to ensure that what was used accurately reflected the online activity during the relevant period. This process enabled the reconstruction of a portion of Emma's communication history on Nexopia, not with absolute detail but sufficiently to identify notable patterns of interaction. The initial analysis focused on communication patterns, frequency of contact, and differences in roles between the accounts Emma interacted with, rather than on specific wording to avoid subjective interpretation. Through this process, several standout communication threads were identified, showing a clear distinction between ordinary interactions with peers and one-sided conversations in which the other party actively directed the content and rhythm of the exchange. The cold case unit analyzed these threads from the perspective of grooming, focusing on characteristic signs such as rapid trust building, the shift of conversation topics from social interaction to private matters, and the gradual way the other party began to control the conversational space. The grooming analysis was not intended to hastily label behavior but to determine whether these interactions matched patterns documented in known cases of exploitation of minors. Analyzing experts noted that while these signs, when viewed individually, might not be sufficient for a conclusion, when examined as part of an extended communication sequence and in the context of a teenage victim, they formed a pattern of concern. More importantly, the old logs revealed the existence of conversations occurring close to the date of Emma's disappearance, a detail that had not received attention in the original investigation due to the inability to place online data within a real-world timeline. The cold case unit synchronized the timestamps in the Nexopia logs with the timeline reconstructed from physical and forensic records, adjusting for time zone differences and platform recording idiosyncrasies to ensure accurate comparison. When the online data was placed into this new timeline, several previously unexplained gaps in the case progression began to be filled, not with new events, but with behavioral context. Investigators noted that the online communication activity did not exist in isolation, but ran parallel to key milestones already identified in the file, creating an additional layer of information about what Emma may have experienced before her disappearance. Placing the Nexopia data into the new timeline allowed the cold case unit to re-examine previous decisions and assumptions in the light of a more tightly connected sequence of events, where online and offline behavior were no longer separate. However, at this stage, the investigative unit maintained the principle of not drawing conclusions beyond what the data permitted, focusing instead on determining the informational value and relevance level of the recovered log. All findings were recorded neutrally, accompanied by assessments of the reliability and limitations of each piece of data, to avoid overstating the role of digital evidence that was already heavily constrained by the passage of time. The recovery of Nexopia data did not provide a complete solution, but it constituted a true digital breakthrough, as for the first time the victim's online behavior was systematically integrated into the investigative file, not as a peripheral detail, but as an integral part of the overall picture. This breakthrough not only expanded understanding of the context leading up to Emma Caldwell's disappearance, but also demonstrated that data once considered too fragmented or too vague for use could now be placed within a new temporal framework, where it helped clarify the progression of events without requiring any speculation beyond what the old logs actually reflected. With updated forensic results and recovered and authenticated digital data, the cold case unit entered the decisive synthesis phase, in which all previously parallel and fragmented information was combined into a complete, unified timeline in terms of space, time, and behavior. This process began by placing crime scene milestones on the same axis as forensic data, including the locations where personal items were found, the location of the body, and recorded environmental parameters, in order to establish the geographical relationships between these points within a continuous structure. Once these milestones were linked, potential distances and directions of movement between them became clearer, allowing investigators to assess the feasibility of previous assumptions about whether the victim moved alone or with external intervention. In parallel, the digital data from Nexopia was placed into the same timeline, with timestamps adjusted to match local time and eliminate recording system discrepancy, creating a seamless sequence of events from the final online interactions to the moment the victim disappeared from the observation of family and community. Integrating the digital data into the physical context enabled the cold case unit to determine that the online activity not only occurred close to the time of disappearance, but also reflected a directed sequence of interactions that matched previously unexplainable gaps in the physical timeline. When forensic milestones including estimated time of death and body condition were placed alongside crime scene markers and digital data, a tight time frame gradually emerged, significantly narrowing the possible window for key events. From this time frame, the cold case unit proceeded to identify plausible movement routes for the victim, not as a single hypothesis, but as a set of routes consistent with both terrain data and established time markers. This included cross-referencing routes from the residential area to the playground, from the playground to the wooded area where items and the body were found, and possible access paths that would not attract attention, all evaluated within the realistic limits of time and a teenager's mobility. When these routes were placed into the timeline, some previously considered equally likely possibilities began to be ruled out due to inconsistency with the overall data, while certain other routes emerged as having significantly higher consistency with the recorded sequence of events. This synthesis process also enabled the cold case unit to establish a behavioral sequence, not by speculating on motive, but by arranging plausible actions in a logical order based on what the data allowed. This behavioral sequence began with directed online interactions, moved to an in-person meeting in a familiar public setting, and ended with movement to a remote area where control and concealment became easier, a sequence consistent with both digital data and the crime scene. Crucially, this sequence was not based on a single source of information, but was the result of layering data from multiple domains, where each layer cross-validated the others through consistency in time and space. When the complete timeline was reconstructed, points that were once considered vague or inexplicable in the old file began to take clear positions, not because of new events, but because the way the old events were now connected had changed. The cold case unit paid particular attention to ensuring that this timeline accurately reflected only what the data truly permitted, avoiding the filling of gaps with unsubstantiated assumptions, as the value of the synthesis lay in its accuracy rather than absolute completeness. Every time marker was attached to a specific data source, allowing traceability and re-verification if needed, ensuring that the timeline was not merely an internal analytical tool, but could withstand independent scrutiny. Reconstructing the complete timeline did not produce a final conclusion regarding responsibility or guilt, but it provided a unified logical framework in which physical, scientific and digital facts coexisted in a comprehensible and verifiable structure. This phase concluded with the cold case unit possessing an overall picture of the sequence of events, in which every action and movement was placed in its correct position within the timeline, creating a solid foundation for evaluating remaining possibilities, without going beyond the scope of what the evidence had and was continuing to show. Once the complete timeline had been reconstructed with consistent spatial, temporal, and behavioral milestones, the cold case unit moved to the suspect narrowing phase by reviewing all hypotheses that had existed in the file and re-evaluating them in light of the new data structure. Possibilities previously considered in parallel, from the victim leaving voluntarily to random scenarios with no external involvement, were progressively ruled out as they could not fit the established sequence of events. The absence of signs of preparation for leaving, the presence of personal items at a remote location, and the continuous timeline eliminated the possibility that the victim voluntarily traveled to the location where the body was found. Hypotheses involving an accident also no longer held up when cross-checked against forensic data and crime scene context, as they could not account for the combination of item locations, body condition, and corresponding time markers. The cold case unit also reviewed individuals who had previously been considered persons of interest during the initial investigation, cross-referencing their schedules, locations, and access opportunities with the markers in the new timeline, thereby gradually eliminating those who could not have been present simultaneously at key points. This process did not proceed by searching for incriminating factors, but by confirming spatial temporal incompatibility, a method that allowed objective narrowing of scope without requiring speculation about motive. As old hypotheses were eliminated, a single data cluster began to stand out due to its internal consistency, tightly linking online behavior, presence in the area, and established time markers. The cold case unit recognized that only one individual fully satisfied all these conditions, appearing in the file at various stages, but never previously considered the primary suspect due to the lack of ability to connect the pieces. Identifying this single suspect did not rely on one piece of evidence alone, but was the result of a systematic elimination process in which every other possibility proved incompatible with the complete timeline, without creating contradiction. This individual had an indirect connection to the analyzed online interactions, had the ability to access key locations within the appropriate time frame, and appeared in an event that had previously been undervalued when considered in isolation. When these elements were placed together, they formed a logical structure that no previous hypothesis could replace. The cold case unit conducted cross-verification of all data related to this subject to ensure that the fit was not the result of selective information, but a natural consequence of the synthesis process. Details once seen as disconnected now aligned perfectly without adjustment, reinforcing the conclusion that the suspect pool had been narrowed to its maximum extent. Identifying a single suspect did not equate to a conclusion of criminal responsibility, but marked the end of the screening and elimination phase, where the file no longer needed to disperse resources across multiple parallel directions. At this point, the cold case unit could focus all attention on one single subject, with the understanding that all subsequent steps must be built on the foundation of evidence already logically and consistently verified. This narrowing down process concluded with the case file transitioning from a state of multiple open possibilities to a focused structure, where all facts pointed toward a single point of convergence, creating a solid foundation for the next steps without relying on speculation or assumptions beyond what the data permitted. After the suspect pool was narrowed down to a single individual based on the consistency of the timeline and aggregated data, the cold case unit entered the case strengthening phase, with the sole objective of increasing the overall solidity of the entire evidentiary structure before taking any legal action. The focus of this phase was not on seeking additional hypotheses, but on re-examining every existing source of information by returning to witnesses who had been contacted during the initial investigation. Re-interviews of witnesses were conducted selectively, concentrating on individuals who had direct or indirect connections to the key milestones in the reconstructed timeline, in order to determine whether their memories might provide any previously overlooked details, or details that had not been properly contextualized. These interviews were not intended to apply pressure or elicit confessions, but to re-record statements after a significant amount of time had passed, when the pressure of the case was no longer as intense, allowing witnesses to reflect on events from a different perspective. The cold case unit paid particular attention to the consistency of statements across different time points, comparing what had been said in the early phase with what was recorded in the new contact, in order to identify stable points of agreement or discrepancies that required explanation. The comparison of statements was not conducted with the aim of finding contradictions to incriminate, but to assess the overall reliability of each information source when placed within the context of the new data. Details once considered unimportant, when placed alongside the complete timeline, began to take on clearer significance, helping to illuminate previously ambiguous time periods or actions. During this process, the cold case unit also reviewed statements related to events that had been previously undervalued in the old file, confirming whether they aligned with the established behavioral pattern, thereby systematically reinforcing or eliminating their value. In parallel with re-interviewing witnesses, investigators cross-referenced all statements with confirmed physical and digital evidence, ensuring that no element of the case file relied on single or uncorroborated information. This cross-referencing process allowed the cold case unit to clearly identify which parts of the file could withstand independent scrutiny and which parts required further reinforcement with additional documentation or legal reasoning. Every connection between online behavior, presence at key locations, and events mentioned by witnesses was examined for feasibility within the established time frame, avoiding forced or contrived linkages. When different sources of information showed natural compatibility without adjustment, the overall reliability of the case file increased significantly. On that basis, the cold case unit began finalizing the legal case file, compiling all evidence, statements and analytical results into a clear logical structure, organized chronologically and by degree of relevance. This file was not merely intended to prove that a sequence of events occurred, but also had to clearly demonstrate how each piece of evidence supported the overall conclusion without mutual contradiction. Finalizing the legal case file required special attention to language and presentation, ensuring that every conclusion was derived from objective data rather than speculation. The cold case unit reviewed the entire document to remove superfluous sections, unnecessary speculative assertions, and retained only those elements with the highest probative value, creating a concise yet robust case file. Each document was linked to a clear source and specific context of use, allowing an independent reader to understand its role in the overall picture without additional explanation. This phase also included the preparation of internal summary documents to help stakeholders quickly grasp the structure and focus of the case file, while ensuring no critical details were overlooked or misunderstood. When the strengthening process was complete, the case file reached a state where all components mutually supported one another, forming a seamless logical structure from the initial data to the current conclusion. The cold case unit concluded this phase with a fully cross-checked, refined, and maximally strengthened case file within the limits of the existing evidence, ready for the next legal review steps without relying on any new assumptions beyond what had been proven. Once the case file had been strengthened with a clear logical structure and all sources of evidence fully cross-verified, the cold case unit moved into the probable cause evaluation phase, with the sole objective of determining whether the existing material met the legal threshold required to proceed with an arrest. The entire case file was submitted to the assigned prosecutor in accordance with procedure, not as an emotional narrative, but as a tightly organized collection of data in which every conclusion was derived from specific verifiable evidence. The submission focused on clarifying the connection between the single identified suspect and the chain of events leading to Emma Caldwell's death, emphasizing consistency in time, location, and behavior without relying on speculation or unproven motive. The prosecutor received the file in an independent evaluative capacity, reviewing each section to determine whether the current evidence was sufficient to establish probable cause under the legal standard, that is, the reasonable basis to believe a crime occurred and that the named individual was likely responsible. This evaluation process required careful scrutiny of each type of evidence, from updated forensic results and authenticated digital data to witness statements that had been cross-referenced and placed within the complete timeline. The prosecutor paid particular attention to how these pieces of evidence supported one another, as probable cause is not built on a single piece of evidence, but on the totality of factors when considered together. Points that had been obstacles in the initial investigation, such as technological limitations or information gaps, were reassessed in the current context to determine whether they still undermined the case. This included considering potential defense challenges, anticipating points where defense counsel might question the legality or reliability of evidence, and evaluating whether the current file was strong enough to withstand those challenges at the charging stage. The cold case unit and prosecutor discussed in detail how each piece of evidence was collected, preserved, and analyzed to ensure there were no breaks in the chain of custody that could lead to the exclusion of critical evidence. The focus of the evaluation was not on proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, the trial standard, but on determining whether the existing elements were strong enough to justify an arrest and prosecution, consistent with legal requirement. The prosecutor closely examined the connection between the established DNA evidence and the timeline milestones, assessing its probative value when combined with digital data and confirmed events, to determine whether the link was sufficiently direct and specific. Discussions centered on ensuring the case did not rely on layered inferences, but on connections that arose naturally from objective data. During this process, certain points in the file were requested to be clarified in presentation, not due to lack of evidence, but to ensure the legal argument was expressed clearly and comprehensibly to those not directly involved in the investigation. The cold case unit made the necessary adjustments, added explanatory materials, and reorganized certain sections to meet these requirements, thereby minimizing the risk of misunderstanding or incomplete evaluation. As the evaluation reached its final stage, The prosecutor issued an overall determination that the legal element necessary to establish probable cause had been satisfied, based on the combination of physical, scientific, and digital evidence within a consistent logical framework. This decision was not a final conclusion of guilt, but a confirmation that the legal threshold for proceeding to the next step had been validly met. The probable cause evaluation concluded with consensus that an arrest could be executed within the bounds of the law, marking the transition from the preparation and analysis phase to the action phase, where the case file ceased to be merely a collection of documents and became the basis for a specific legal decision. After the probable cause evaluation was completed and the arrest action was approved within the legal framework, the cold case unit coordinated with relevant units to implement a controlled arrest plan for the suspect, ensuring the safety of the executing officers as well as the preservation of any evidence that might arise during the process. The plan was developed based on current information regarding the suspect's residence, daily habits, and schedule, with the goal of approaching and securing the subject without unnecessarily escalating the situation. Once the execution time was determined, participating units moved to the target area and established appropriate containment, ensuring all possible escape routes were under observation to prevent flight or destruction of evidence. The approach to the suspect followed proper procedure, with clear identification of the executing officers and the legal basis for the arrest, ensuring legality and transparency from the outset. The suspect was secured and taken into custody without significant resistance, allowing the executing team to quickly proceed to the next steps in the pre-planned operation. During the arrest, investigators carefully noted the suspect's reactions and behavior, not for psychological interpretation, but to ensure all developments were accurately documented for the procedural record. Immediately after the suspect was removed from the residence, protection of the relevant scene was initiated to facilitate the collection of additional physical evidence, which was considered an inseparable part of this action phase. Investigators carried out the seizure within the approved scope, focusing on items likely to be directly related to the established timeline milestones, while avoiding any expansion of the search beyond the permitted limit. Each item of evidence was meticulously documented regarding its location, condition, and context of discovery, ensuring the chain of custody remained intact from seizure to storage. The collection of additional evidence was not aimed at finding surprises, but at corroborating and reinforcing what had already been established in the case file, confirming that previously constructed connections had appropriate physical foundation. Investigators handled each item with extreme care, fully aware that any error at this stage could compromise the legal value of the evidence, regardless of its significance. Throughout the seizure process, all actions followed the predetermined sequence, with supervisory personnel present to ensure full compliance with legal and operational regulation. Upon completion of the seizure, the evidence was sealed and inventoried with detailed descriptions for later comparison and analysis within the prosecution framework. The arrest of the suspect and the seizure of additional evidence marked a clear transition from the evaluation and preparation phase to the concrete action phase, where the case file no longer existed only on paper but had resulted in direct intervention. For the cold case unit, this was the outcome of a systematic series of steps, where each decision was grounded in rigorously vetted legal and evidentiary foundation. The arrest was not viewed as the end of the case, but it affirmed that the investigation had reached a threshold where it could be translated into real-world action without exceeding legal boundaries. With the suspect removed from the scene and the evidence safely preserved, this action phase concluded with full documentation of the entire process in the case file, reflecting a major turning point where years of analysis had produced a concrete result, laying the foundation for subsequent legal proceedings. When the trial officially begins, the entire focus is placed squarely on presenting the chain of evidence in a clear, coherent sequence that strictly adheres to procedural rules, with the goal of helping the jury understand how each individual piece of data connects to form a complete picture of the case's progression. The prosecution opens by establishing the general context of the case, not to evoke emotion, but to set the essential foundational timeline necessary for receiving the evidence, then proceeds to introduce each group of evidence in the chronological order already established in the file. The evidence sequence starts with the most objective data, including the updated forensic results, presented by experts who explain the methods of collection, preservation, and analysis to prove the scientific validity of the conclusions reached. These results are presented in clear explanatory language, focusing on the connection between biological samples and the established timeline of events, while avoiding unnecessary technical jargon to ensure the jury can follow and understand their probative value. Next, digital evidence is introduced as a supporting layer of information, not as the sole decisive factor, but as part of the overall structure, where online behavior is placed in its proper position within the chain of events. The prosecution clarifies how the timestamps from this data have been calibrated and synchronized with the overall timeline, demonstrating that they do not exist in isolation, but reflect interactions directly related to real-world events. Once the physical and digital evidence has been presented, witness testimony is introduced to reinforce the overall picture, with emphasis on the consistency between what witnesses observed and what the objective data shows. This sequence allows each type of evidence to support the others, minimizing the risk of any single element being isolated or misinterpreted when viewed alone. During the trial, cross-examination plays a pivotal role in testing the strength of the evidence chain, as the defense raises questions to clarify limitations, potential biases, or alternative interpretations of each piece of evidence presented. Forensic and digital experts must clearly explain their methods and conclusions, addressing questions about accuracy, cross-contamination, and environmental factors that could affect results, while maintaining consistency with the documented record. The prosecution responds to these questions by returning to the overall structure of the case, emphasizing that the value of evidence lies not in any single detail but in their combined coherence when considered together. Cross-examination of witnesses focuses on comparing current testimony with prior statements, clarifying consistent points and explaining minor discrepancies that may arise due to the passage of time, thereby protecting the overall reliability of the testimony. When the defendant is cross-examined as required by procedure, questions are designed to test the consistency between the explanations offered and the proven timeline of events, not to force self-contradiction, but to highlight irreconcilable points between statements and objective data. The defense seeks to reaffirm previously given explanations, while the prosecution places them within the complete timeline, demonstrating their incompatibility when viewed against the full body of evidence. Throughout this process, the judge maintains a coordinating role, ensuring that all questions and arguments remain within permissible bounds and do not distort the central focus on evaluating the evidence. When the presentation and cross-examination conclude, the full picture of the case has been placed before the jury in the form of a logical structure, where each piece has a clear position and function. The trial does not aim to recreate emotion or speculate about motive, but focuses on determining whether the presented chain of evidence is sufficiently convincing to meet the legal standard of proof. The trial phase thus becomes the final test of years of investigative effort, where each piece of evidence must withstand rigorous scrutiny and every argument must prove its reasonableness within the legal framework. When the parties complete their presentations, the case file ceases to be an internal collection of documents and becomes a fully exposed structure before the court, ready for independent and comprehensive evaluation based on what was presented and tested during the trial. When the trial officially opens, the entire focus of the case shifts from investigation to presentation, where conclusions only have value if proven through legally admissible evidence and clear legal logic before the jury. The prosecution begins by establishing the trial structure according to the chronological framework already built in the file, not to retell the story emotionally, but to provide the jury with a clear cognitive framework for receiving and evaluating evidence. The evidence sequence is deployed starting with the most objective elements. First, the forensic results, including estimated time of death, condition of the body, and biological traces collected at the scene and from related vehicles. Forensic experts in turn explain their working method, sample preservation conditions, scientific limitations at the time of initial collection, and reasons why newer analyses can yield more accurate conclusions, helping the jury understand that these results are not reinterpretations of the past, but legitimate exploitation of evidence that always existed. Once the scientific foundation is established, the prosecution introduces digital data, presenting the process of recovery, authentication, and alignment of Nexopia logs with the physical event timeline, emphasizing temporal and behavioral continuity rather than the emotional content of communication. This data is presented as supporting the overall evidence chain, showing that online and offline behavior are not separate, but reflect the same progression, thereby reinforcing the established timeline. Next, the prosecution presents crime scene evidence, concluding the location where personal items were found, the geographic connections between points, and their consistency with the reconstructed movement route, enabling the jury to clearly visualize the spatial context of the crime without relying on speculation. Witness testimony is introduced only after the physical and digital evidence foundation has been laid, with the purpose of reinforcement rather than replacement of objective data. The prosecution emphasizes consistency across time in witness statements and their alignment with the overall timeline, while clarifying minor differences that may arise due to time-affected memory, thereby protecting the overall value of the testimony. During cross-examination, the defense focuses on testing the reliability of each evidence group, questioning the limitations of forensic analysis, potential errors in digital data, and the accuracy of witness testimony after many years. Experts called for cross-examination must clearly explain methods, allowable margins of error, and reasons their conclusions remain valid within scientific bounds, acknowledging limitations rather than avoiding them to prevent misunderstanding. The prosecution responds by redirecting attention to the overall structure of the file, stressing that no single piece of evidence is required to be absolutely perfect in isolation. Their value lies in their mutual fit and support when viewed alongside the entire body of data. Cross-examination of witnesses focuses on confirming recorded timelines, locations, and behaviors, while making clear that no single testimony stands alone to decide the case outcome. When the defendant is cross-examined in accordance with procedure, questions center on the consistency between offered explanations and the proven chain of events, particularly irreconcilable points between testimony and objective. The defense attempts to re-establish earlier explanations once accepted during the initial investigation phase, while the prosecution places them within the complete timeline context, showing they no longer hold up when compared against the full current evidence. The judge maintains a coordinating role throughout the trial, ensuring questions do not exceed permissible scope and arguments remain focused on evidence evaluation. When both sides complete their presentation and cross-examination, the jury has been presented with a comprehensive picture of the case, not as an emotional narrative, but as a logical structure built from scientific, digital, and verified testimonial data. The trial thus becomes the final testing ground for the multi-year investigation, where every piece of evidence faces rigorous scrutiny and every argument must prove its reasonableness within the legal framework. When the trial phase concludes, the case file has been fully laid bare before the court, ready for the jury to render judgment based on the presented chain of evidence and arguments, marking the point where legal truth takes shape not in the investigation room, but in the formal trial setting. When the trial phase concludes and all evidence has been fully presented in court, the case moves to the deliberation stage, where the jury retires to evaluate the entire file in isolation from public arguments. Deliberation proceeds strictly according to legal procedure, with the jury examining each element of the offense based on the judge's instructions, focusing on the core question of whether the presented chain of evidence meets the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Jury members systematically review the evidence sequence as arranged by the prosecution, cross-referencing forensic results, digital data, and witness testimony to assess the internal consistency of the entire file. The focus of discussion is not on emotion or speculation about motive, but on determining whether the proven timelines, locations, and behaviors reasonably exclude alternative possibilities. During this process, points emphasized by the defense, such as limitations of individual evidence or alternative explanations, are placed alongside the overall file structure to evaluate their persuasiveness when considered with the complete data set. The jury analyzes how the evidence supports itself, concluding that the file's strength lies not in any single proof, but in the layering of multiple independent sources converging on the same conclusion. Discussions center on whether remaining gaps are large enough to create reasonable doubt, and whether alternative hypotheses can withstand scrutiny against the complete timeline presented in court. After thorough consideration, the jury reaches unanimity on the legal questions posed, determining that the chain of evidence meets the required standard for a verdict. When the jury returns to the courtroom, Silence falls as the verdict is announced according to protocol, reflecting the outcome of independent and collective evaluation. The verdict is pronounced clearly, based on the relevant legal provisions and the elements proven at trial, affirming the defendant's criminal responsibility for the death of Emma Caldwell. Following the verdict, the judge proceeds to sentencing within the statutory framework, considering the severity of the conduct, aggravating circumstances, and factors related to protecting the public interest. The sentence is imposed not for revenge, but to deliver justice and reflect the proven dangerousness of the conduct, while ensuring the decision aligns with legal principles and applicable precedent. During sentencing, the judge clarifies that the decision rests entirely on the evidence and arguments presented in court, unaffected by external factors or public pressure. The verdict and sentence conclude the adversarial phase of the case, transforming years of investigation into an official, binding legal conclusion. The sentencing is not symbolic, but constitutes confirmation that the justice system has fulfilled its function within the rule of law, removing the case from unresolved status and placing it in a clearly defined legal position. When the trial ends, the case file ceases to be a contested collection of evidence and becomes a pronounced judgment, reflecting the final outcome of the trial process. The verdict phase thus marks the moment when the central legal question of the case receives an official answer, closing the stage where truth had to be proven in court and establishing a binding legal conclusion entirely separate from the speculation and hypotheses that existed throughout the investigation and litigation. After the verdict is pronounced and the sentence takes legal effect, the Emma Caldwell case file officially moves to resolved status, marking the end of a process that stretched from the moment the victim disappeared until criminal responsibility was clearly established. Closing the file is not merely an administrative action, but a confirmation that all investigative and procedural obligations have been fully met within the legal framework, with conclusions built on a foundation of verified evidence. The Cold Case Unit conducts a final review of all related documents, ensuring that investigation results, legal decisions, and the sentence are properly archived, forming a complete file available for future reference if needed. In parallel with completing procedures, the investigative unit conducts an overall assessment of the reasons the case remained unsolved for many years, focusing on systemic factors rather than individual failings. This analysis shows that the prolonged status did not stem from lack of effort or major early errors, but primarily from technological limitations in forensics and digital analysis at the time of the crime, combined with legal barriers that prevented reasonable suspicions from being converted into prosecutable action. Biological samples not yet suitable for advanced analysis, online data not yet recognized as high-value evidence, and limited data aggregation tools created a gap that investigators at the time could not bridge. Additionally, resource allocation pressures and strategic administrative decisions amid multiple concurrent cases contributed to the file being closed without sufficient legal grounds to proceed. The assessment of reasons for delay is not intended to criticize the past, but to understand the objective conditions that shape the case's trajectory, thereby placing the final outcome in its proper historical and operational context. From this analysis, clear and systematic investigative lessons emerge, centered on the importance of long-term evidence preservation, thorough documentation of data even when it cannot be immediately exploited, and maintaining the ability to reevaluate files as technology and investigative methods advance. The case demonstrates the value of an integrated approach, where physical, forensic, and digital data must be placed within the same analytical structure rather than existing in isolation, while highlighting the role of specialized units in revisiting old cases with fresh perspective. Another recorded lesson is the necessity of properly storing and standardizing online data, as information once considered secondary can become pivotal when placed in the right context and processed with appropriate tools. The closure of the Emma Caldwell file thus not only ends one specific case, but also contributes to the improvement of investigative practice, providing real-world experience for handling complex cases in the future. When the file is archived as resolved, it does not disappear from the system but becomes a reference document, reflecting both the limitations of the past and the potential for progress in the present. This final stage affirms that justice in long cold cases does not always arrive quickly, but can be achieved when data is preserved, methods are improved, and decisions are made based on comprehensive analysis. Closing the file is therefore not merely an ending but confirmation that what was once overlooked can be revisited and resolved when conditions permit, leaving a clear conclusion and a valuable lasting set of lessons for criminal investigation work. Emma Caldwell's story reminds Americans today that danger rarely appears like it does in movies. It can begin with very ordinary things. A late afternoon in late 2003, a 15-year-old girl leaving home saying, "I'm just meeting a friend for a bit," heading to a familiar playground, then vanishing without a trace. The first clue being a monkey backpack and polka dot wallet, containing an ID medical card found in the woods. The real-world lesson here is to treat digital safety as part of real-life safety. Later Nexopia data revealed grooming patterns that are far from uncommon today. They are even more prevalent on social media, gaming platforms and direct message. Families should establish clear leaving home rules. Always state exactly who you're going with, where and when you'll return. If plans change, send a confirmation message, enable location sharing when out after dark, and most important, children must know that a something feels wrong feeling is reason enough to leave and contact an adult. For the community, the story shows the value of reporting to police early and providing specific information, because details that seem minor at first, like a traffic stop on a remote road, blood on a driver's chin, a knife and crowbar, the explanation hunting may not be usable immediately but can become key when technology advances. Finally, if you were ever a witness who just noticed something off, don't hesitate to report. Silence cools a case. One timely call can preserve a critical puzzle piece, so that years later when DNA is retested and old logs are recovered, justice still has a path back. If you feel Emma Caldwell's story shows why even a small detail can change the fate of an entire case, please subscribe to the channel to follow more cold cases solved through patience and evidence. Thank you for watching until the end, and see you in the next video, where we continue diving into stories where justice had to wait a very long time to finally speak.